He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director, and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 26 years of experience. Together, we're the Brief Brothers, having an ongoing conversation about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. We're back for another episode, Henry, number 60. We're really racking them up. Today, we're joined by a guest from a mountain cabin somewhere in the United States. We didn't quite get the exact location, but his name is Dan Nelken. He's a freelance creative and the author of a brand new book called A Self-Help Guide for Copywriters. We had a great conversation. Let's tune in.
Let's.
All right, Henry, we're back, and we have a special guest all the way from a mountaintop someplace in North America. He didn't tell us exactly where. It's Dan Nelken. He's a senior level freelance creative, a copywriter, and I connected with Dan on LinkedIn, especially and most recently because he's got a new book out, which he's going to tell us. And the title of that book is A Self-Help Guide for Copywriters, a resource for writing headlines. Actually, that's probably the first chapter, but he'll tell us. So Dan, thank you for joining Henry and me on the Brief Brothers. We are really excited to have you.
Hi, fellas. I'm excited to be here. I've been looking forward to this, and it's great to kind of not meet you in person, but moving picture anyway.
Well, let's start off, Dan, and talk about your amazing book, which I have read. I breezed through it, and I do want to get and I told you before that I've got the ebook version, so I don't have something to play with or mark up the way I'm accustomed to, but I wanted to get it as quickly as possible. And it's a great book. Did I have the title right? It is a self-help guide for copywriters, a resource for writing headlines. Is that the subhead?
Yes. Okay. That's it. Yep.
It is available on
you.
Amazon. Tell us about how did this get started? What was the genesis of it? How long did it take you to write? How much fun did you have? Was it a headache?
Well, I tell you, there were definitely times where I wanted to, I think several. I thought I would just stop. It actually started out as a course. I had a friend of mine who, at that time, I was a creative director for an animation studio. And we used to do these animated explainer videos for startups and companies all over the world, which is a whole other tangent we can go into if we want. But we did an explainer video for a company called Udemy, udemy.com. And my partner ended up, and so what they do is they do it's like virtual classes. There was a lot. They were one of the first to do it, and my partner, who is kind of an engineer, animator, just kind of good at making things, made a course. And so on top of our little business, that was doing very well for him. And then he made another course. This course was on how to make a course. And so I thought, oh hell, I'm going to do this. And so as I started to do it, I chose headlines, which is what the book's about 5 years later, and I still haven't done the course. I met with a creative director at Lululemon, and they wanted me to come in for a contract. I couldn't at the time, but I had mentioned, as I started to chip away at this book, even I realized how much I needed this course on how to write headlines. And I told him kind of the premise, and that was it. We were having lunch. I went home, and it was an hour later. He said, well, it's too bad you can't freelance, but can you come in and teach this course to our creative department? And of course, I didn't have anything at that point, and so I sent a high estimate to hopefully scare him off. And I thought, well, if he goes for it, I guess I'll have to put this thing together. He just said, I sent the estimate, and he said, can you sort out lunch? And I was like, oh shit. So as part of this estimate, I said they'd get a leave behind, this booklet summarizing everything that I didn't yet have. And he's like, yeah, great. And so I started with that, and I got to it's probably 90 pages. And then he was canned. And so I never had to do it. And so I was kind of relieved. But then I had this 90-page booklet course thing. So I was probably over 2 years. I realized, well, this is a book, and I just kept chipping away at it. And then, I think, again, it just reinforced how much I needed it and how much I was learning. And that's the perspective I wrote it from, was just like, what did I need? How did I need to hear it? And I think that's why it's resonating with people. It wasn't like, I'm an expert and I know all this and I'm going to share my wisdom. It kind of came from, Jesus, I'm not that good at this either. I've been doing this a while. And I think as I went down this path, I talked to very senior people, creative directors at top agencies. And as soon as I shared my insecurities and why I was doing this, they were like, yeah, I feel the same way. And so I just validated for me that I was on to something and that this was needed. But again, when I launched it, I had no idea how it would be received.
Well, I think you're probably being modest about your skills, you know, as a copywriter. But I do think it's an interesting, because both Howard and I, you know, Howard makes a living teaching workshops, and I teach them for fun. But I think one of the benefits of teaching or taking what you've learned and putting it in some sort of context where you're going to share it with somebody else is that it gives you an opportunity to sit down and consolidate your learnings from over your career. So you've learned all these things, but they're all like loose strands in your brain. And when you're forced to sit down and organize them, I think it's almost like the same thing as when you're in high school, and just the part about taking notes helps reinforce it in your memory and helps you be more at one with the material.
I think that's it, Henry, because when I was writing it too, a lot of it was, I didn't even realize I did that or I knew that. And it was just getting it out. And it led to one of the lines in the book that was the difference between having a process and knowing your process is the difference between insecurity or self-doubt and confidence. Just seeing it and emptying it out. It's like you say, you know, when you read a book, in the moment you're reading a book and it feels like it's really helping you and changing your life, and then the next day you're doing the same dumb shit again. But if you read a book, take notes, read through those notes, which is what I do now, I'm able to, because I'm sharing and creating content, quote them. They're just more top of mind. I can access that knowledge when I couldn't before, or you put your process into words.
Go figure. We're creatures of habit that get conditioned through repetition. I mean, it's simple, but it's, you know, who's got the time for repetition? Who's got the time for, you know?
That's Well, that's it. And that's why, as a freelancer, sorry, Howard, but I found like maybe a lazy freelancer. Well, I work really hard and then I take time off. It's given me the opportunity to think about thinking, where most people who are in it don't have that opportunity. And so I think I do have that time, and I make that time now. That it's really important to me.
Well, that was one of the things that I really liked about reading your book, was that you were referencing books that I've read, like James Webb Young's A Technique for Producing Ideas, a book I stumbled across decades ago. Yeah. And I think I probably bought 10 or 12 copies over my career because I just give them out. Yeah. You know, because the version I have, and the one I love to talk about, I mean, look how tiny it is. You know, this is the one with the foreword by Bill Bernbach. Yeah. That's my favorite version. And it's preaches, it hits you over the head with, you need to know where your brain is in the process of coming up with an idea. And once you know these 5 steps, you can be self-aware, so that when you are stumbling, it's because you don't have enough information. And then when you have enough information and your brain is overloaded, you say, I got to go out and take a walk, so that your brain can shift and turn into something else. When you recognize where you are in these steps, you become a better thinker. And when we're young, we may not really, we don't know that. We just don't have that kind of self-awareness.
But I also feel like, and this is, I can confidently say it's more than my experience. This is one thing I wasn't sure of with the book, because I felt like, man, agencies I work for or bigger brands I work for really knew very little about creativity, how the mind works, what the mind needs. I can say that it wasn't just my experience because of how the book has been received. It just feels like it's such a huge miss. I think it's because we're all on the hamster wheel. Like, this is the one main tool we're working with. Like, I read a book recently called, it's amazing, Mind Management, Not Time Management. We're so focused on time. And it's what this guy knows. And actually, funny that we're having this call Thursday afternoon. That's when he schedules. His name is David Kadavi. All of his interviews or podcast interviews or appearances on Thursday afternoon. It's because he knows his brain. He's most creative Monday morning after he's taken a break, which, going back to James Webb Young, one of the steps is walking away from it. So it's no surprise. Monday mornings consistently are his most creative time for his brain. Monday mornings then are most creative at the beginning of the week. And by Friday, that's when he does his like taxes or financial stuff. But Thursday afternoons, he's like, he knows Wednesday, I got to hit it by Wednesday, because after that it starts to fade and picks up again.
You know, I think it's ironic. We've had Paul Feldwick on the show, talking about, his 2 books. And it seems like that for an industry that produces ideas for advertising, we don't understand fully or don't spend a lot of time thinking about how advertising works or how ideas are generated. It's all up to the individual to figure it out for himself, how ideas are generated. And as organizations, we're all stumbling around with some vague idea of how advertising works in the minds of consumers, but no real consensus or scientific approach to it.
No, and I mean, you can learn so much from science and neuroscientists about how the brain works. Yet, the thing that inspired that guy's book was, he says, he'd spend 12 hours hammering away at something, and then in 15 minutes he'd get a full day's work done. He was like, wonder if I could just find that 15 minutes. That's what drove him. And I can definitely relate to that. I'm sure you guys too, work until wee hours of the morning on a pitch or whatever. And I think especially now with more content on more channels than ever before, shorter timelines, shrinking budgets, at least across the mediums, we need to start developing systems. And I know the guys at Ad House NYC, Paul Fix and Tom Chrisman. I don't know if you've seen the Ad House of cards that they've created, that deck of cards.
Now that you say it, I think I have seen it, a reference on LinkedIn.
Yeah, so what it is basically a different ad technique, and if you're kind of stuck, it'll help you like brainstorming. But it's based on a scientific study analyzed I don't know how many hundreds of award-winning campaigns, and found that there's actually only something like 6 techniques that we are repeated. Yeah, we would always think, well, that's not creative to repeat a structure, and then they have all these like sub techniques that come out of them. And there really aren't that many, yet we're always starting with this blank page, and it could be anything. But it's like, films or sitcoms, they all have a structure. It's the content that changes, or the combination of these structures are messing with them. Yet, I don't know if we're too proud or it's our egos to be like, there can be no structure to creativity. It actually aids it. Science will aid it, but we're not really tapping into it.
That's the definition of a creative brief. It is a structure, and you need these guardrails in order to figure out where I can play and where I shouldn't play. Creatives routinely, Henry and I talk about this all the time. We routinely push back on rules and regulations when we need them. You've got to have them.
Yeah, and I was going to say that's a perfect segue into the brief, because you talked about a blank page, and that's paralyzing, right? And so in a way, the brief is a way of, so creatives don't start with a blank page. They start with some pieces of the puzzle, so that they can find and fit in the other pieces of the puzzle to actually do the work and get started on the work.
I even call it
honestly, a
chance to resist. I mean, if a well-written brief is going to spring great ideas right away, you're going to riff on ideas. If it's a well-written brief, even if it's resisting the ideas, that's a reaction to the imprisonment, the intended imprisonment of a brief.
Yeah, you have to start somewhere. And I think, man, I've worked with so many talented people over the years that don't create anything for themselves. And I think it's because there's no box. You can literally create anything, and they don't know where to start. So they do this, and they need that little box to resist or embrace whatever it is. But yeah, I think, to think outside any box, you first have to kind of start in one. And I think that's what a brief does for us.
So before we move on to another topic, is there anything else related to the book? You were telling us, you came up with it from materials you had developed for like a workshop or a course that you were going to teach. Was there anything, how did the book finally come to be, and you self-published it, and what's the reaction been?
Yeah, I mean, the one other thing I'll say that's kind of a bit different about this book is I think I really dive into that insecurity as I wrote it, that I think I know a lot of like high level creatives that have felt it, or imposter syndrome. And so I did dig a little bit into neuroscience and what's going on in the brain and body, that how we're reacting when we are stuck, what we make it mean, that kind of negative self-talk, and how to stop that spiral. So I think that's one other thing that's a little bit different, hence the title, A Self-Help Guide for Copywriters, which is a little tongue-in-cheek, but not entirely. And then I'll jump to like, yeah, it took me a few years to do it, lots of iterations, and it was just a fun thing on the side that I kind of fell in love with doing. And every time I opened it, I felt like it got a little bit better. I just got to a point where I could work on it forever, and it was just time to let it go. And well, the response has been amazing. It's been like a top trending book on Amazon in the advertising category for probably 2 months now. So how it goes up, it's been as high as number 2. I don't know who the guy is who wrote number 1, but I've got his book on my reading list. It's like $100 million offers or something. But yeah, funny, I see it and it's going past Seth Godin and of course Luke Sullivan, who we know, and I know has been on, and he's like a huge inspiration for me. And now I think I'm probably behind him, but it goes up and down. But consistently for 2 months, it's been top 20, top 10, then it drops in several countries. But when I self-published it, I did it very quietly. Honestly, I didn't realize I was like just full of like fear and wanted to curl up into a ball and just kind of roll away. And I think I had not thought about people reading it. I was so focused on, after having so many ideas over the years, that I abandoned just finishing something. And so then, man, feedback has just been so positive. To be asked to be on this show, I have several more coming up, and people reaching out. I open my computer, look at my phone. The thing is tagged daily. I'm tagged daily multiple times by people. I just say this to people all the time, just shaking my head. Like I just can't believe it. It feels just so awesome. I think as a freelancer, you don't have, you're not getting the promotions, the validation to see. You also can't compare yourself to others. Yeah, you don't have it.
You've touched on
cool.
Yeah, you've touched on a few things that really resonated with me, and one is, this idea of imposter syndrome. It's not an advertising specific thing, but I do think that it can manifest itself greatly in advertising because of exactly what we just talked about, right? Like, this is a very subjective field where there's no real rules, there's no real understanding of what makes a great ad, and so we're all kind of just bullshitting at a certain level. And so if you have any sort of self-discipline, you're questioning yourself, like, am I really doing something, or am I just bullshitting? Especially, and I can relate to it because my degree was in economics. I wasn't ever planning on getting into advertising, got into advertising on a lark, got into strategy because I felt that there was a need for it at the boutique agency I was working at, and basically have been self-taught, most of my career. I didn't really start working with a mentor till probably 10 years or longer into my career. So I think it's something that a lot of people in the ad business can relate to, not just creatives. It's just it's a field that feels so ungrounded in anything concrete that it's easy to feel like, again, you're just BSing.
That's why I think it's so important to control what you can. Like, when you work, if it's mornings, and it is mornings for most people, that's sacred time. So like, no meetings. That's when you're thinking, because if you don't know, otherwise you're constantly winging it. You control what you control, when, how, learning like foundational stuff. Like this book, I mean, I'm like, I don't even care to sell it. Like, I wrote the thing that would have helped me, and it did help me, and I wrote it kind of with the like compassionate hand I probably needed. And I didn't have that mentorship. And actually, especially the amount of people who've reached out asking me to be a mentor, especially through COVID, when you're not in the office, you're working from home, it's not as easy to just walk up to someone. I think we talk so much about building your craft, but we don't do it. And I think it's because we touched on earlier, we're so busy with the next brief. But agencies have to start doing it, especially with this trend of people going freelance or recognizing some freedom and increase productivity when they're at home and not as distracted.
Another thing you mentioned that really resonated with me was this idea of negative self-talk and self-sabotage, which again, it's not unique to our industry, but it's almost like the fear of success almost outweighs the fear of failure. Like if we win this thing, I'm gonna have to work on this night and day for the next. If this happens, like how am I gonna scale what I just did and be able to continue doing the other things I need? There's almost, it's a double-edged sword, like the fear of failure, but also the fear of success.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, I want to speak up a little bit for what experience can do for you. I mean, we're three somewhat older guys, and with the exception of Henry, Dan and I are out on our own. We're freelancers. We're not part of the multiple levers and pulleys and cogs of a big agency. Guys like George Tannenbaum have railed against the big bad holding companies and is now doing better than he probably ever dreamed he could on his own, and good for him. Mm-hmm. I recall reading in your pages, Dan, about that fear of, can I do this again? Can I come up with another headline? Can I come up with another idea? And I remember there was a point in my career when every brief brought almost a paralyzing fear. Can I do this again? Mm-hmm. But somewhere along the line, and I'm thinking when I took the job at Team One Advertising back in the mid 90s and was playing with some serious folks, some serious professional advertising creatives at that shop. Tom Cordner was leading the band there. At some point, we were doing enough projects and I got another brief and I said, I know I can do this. Mm-hmm. It was like one day I was in doubt. Mm-hmm. And the next day was like, no, I got this. Yeah. Now, was I working on, major brand campaigns? Not necessarily, but I think there's a point for some of us at least that mm-hmm. when you acquire enough experience and you've been in the trenches and you've got to churn out the ideas. And I think Cameron Day talked about this a little bit too. You don't always have to hit A+. You don't have to always hit home runs. Sometimes mm-hmm. you can, if you just hit a double because a client needs the work, you learn how to hit doubles, and you need to be satisfied that you can hit doubles because it still solves the problem.
Something Conan O'Brien said recently about something he was said to him once on creativity. He said, well, hopefully at the end of his career, he's judged on his best work. And he said he was told the analogy was like tiles. Every piece you're doing is a tile. Some are dark, some are gray. You might have 7 gray ones in a row, but then you'll get one that's beautiful and bright. And it's like to not judge every piece, and not everyone is meant to be great, which I really love. But to your point, Howard, I find experience, if enough times you tell yourself, oh, I suck or I can't do this, and yet you do, eventually you realize the voice is a liar, and it's coming from somewhere else. And I think you can kind of like, if you pay attention to your process and you're younger and not experienced, you can start to catch it earlier. You have to pay attention to the thought process, maybe even write them down, and pay attention to the results, and you'll just see that this is not adding up, and this obviously isn't helping. And that's what the book was for me, was like, oh, I saw it very clearly. And as I built my skill set, I became more aware of what I already knew and built it, and I'm still a working creative, I was able to draw on these things, and it was like that voice, of course, it's never like gone. I went from like insecure copywriter, now I'm an insecure author, so I'm evolving. But yeah, you're perfect. Yeah.
I think, I said this to Cameron. I don't know if I said this to you. I think I said it in my review on Amazon. There are two books now that I've read that I wish I had had 37, 38 years ago when I was just starting out. I'm pretty much dating myself. My first advertising job was in 1985, 1986. But if I had Cameron's book, which shared war stories, how to get along with people, how to deal with the internal workings of an agency, and your book where you create these buckets. I love the idea of the buckets. And I don't want to give too much away because I want people to buy your book and read it. But the buckets was a great way to compartmentalize your thinking. And it's almost like, I've got 10 minutes. I'm going to do something in this 10 minutes, but I've got 10 minutes, in an hour from now, I'm going to do 10 minutes. And that's how you can never waste a moment. And that's how my brain works. I try to find these moments. But your buckets did the same thing. So your book cool. And Cameron's book, man, I wish I had them 40 years ago.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, those buckets, really the like essence of those buckets is when I started to break down ideas or how I wrote a headline, where it started and where it ended. I just realized that where it starts is super obvious. It's like the dumbest. You start on the surface with anything. Any great idea started on the surface, a surface level idea. And like the analogy I gave was like digging for oil, and you go down and down, and you have to like dig, and you go down layer upon layer, but you have to start on the surface. And the buckets were like, find these surface areas, first ideas that come from getting that brief, or if you're creating the brief and looking for that, single-minded proposition or whatever you're calling it in the brief, you start on the surface, and then with each one you have 20 of these buckets. What first thoughts come off those, which are actually second thoughts? Then you go through them, and it's like without even noticing it, you're like, hey, and all your brain needs is like something, like you said earlier, to resist or embrace. And the buckets just help you like get stuff out and get started. You can start with literally almost anything. The brains are so amazing.
So I'm thinking a couple of things as you speak. The first is your book, I think, could be incredibly useful for strategists, particularly given, Howard and I share this belief with him that single-minded propositions need to be like headliney and they're almost advertising copy in and of themselves with a different audience. The audience is the creatives. So I always talk about brief writing as writing. That it's important for us to be writers as well as, researchers and observers of humanity and all that. But the other thing that I was thinking about was the analogy that I've drawn sometimes. And I heard a stand-up comic talking about this once, and I wish I could remember who it was. I want to say it might have been Jimmy Norton, but I follow stand-up comedy a lot. I not just watching stand-up, like I'm fascinated in the business of writing and performing and the business part of it and the traveling and how these guys, and maybe in the back of my mind, it's one of those things I wish I would do, but have a fear of doing. But But in any case, the point was he was making was, the writing process. Let's say that something happens, a current event that's very topical. There's a joke that pretty much everybody is going to come up with, and that's that surface level idea that you're talking about. And then it's an iterative process. The second time you look at it, you might come up with a second joke that's a little bit more of a different spin on that initial kind of joke that everybody else would have. But typically by the third or fourth iteration, you're going to come at it from a different angle. That's your angle. And it's an angle that's going to be different than anybody else's. And the trick is not to stop with the first joke, not to stop with the second joke, to continue challenging yourself to, and that's another thing is, that I hear is, these comics, they work on the road and their act is never fully formed. Like they're testing lines, they're testing cadence, they're testing a word here, a word there, with the idea of they're perfecting it to eventually get to like a 1,500 seat theater and perform it for in front of a camera. And by that time, it's already refined. I think we have that same process, micro, right? Like I think we can't forget that iterative part of the process.
Well, you look too, I think too many of us discount, I'll say those obvious truths, but a lot of the best comics, they come from these relatable human truths. And then it's like, it's what we do with them where the magic kind of lies. But I think they seem too obvious to look at someone like Seinfeld.
Yep.
I quote him in the book, but that guy's amazing. And I think it was a lesson for me. I was doing the TV spot it was a scratch and win. And we kind of had the scratch and win or scratch offs, but I don't know if you call them the same thing, but the brand was scratch and win. And we had a line, it was like, or a concept, odds of X happening, 1 in a zillion, odds of winning scratch and win, 1 in 4. And so we'd have a scenario, and the client was really pushing us into like every day we want a couple kind of situations. And I was pushing back as a young creative. I just felt like it was so boring. I thought creative was doing something nobody had ever thought of, and almost like an act of defiance. We had the scripts we were going to present, but I was like not happy. I'm like, okay, what's the most obvious thing between kind of a couple? And it was a woman walking into a room and saying, hey, honey, do I look fat in these pants? Did these pants make me look fat? Essentially. So I was like, I'm going to run with that. It's like a stereotypical scenario. And how can I turn that on its head? And I did. And that spot, I actually remember the dialogue. He's watching football. He's sitting on the couch. You can hear it. And she walks in and says, hey, honey, does this look good? And he's like, yeah, it looks great. And she's like, honestly. And he mutes the TV and he says, honestly? All right, well, you have a mesomorphic body shape, so that drop waistline only magnifies your short legs. So to elongate the leg line and give the illusion you even have a calf muscle, you really ought to be wearing at least a 2-inch heel. And he breaks it down very technically. And it says odds, she wanted an honest opinion, 1 in whatever, odds of winning scratch and win 1 in 4. Now, actually, you turn something very relatable. Everyone thinks they know where it's going. And it was a spot I was quite proud of. And I learned a lot from that one spot.
Yep, that's a great story.
Yeah, it is.
How to take the mundane and really find either the absurd or the humor in it. And I think the point is that any situation can be a situation in which something creative comes out of it, something interesting comes out of it if you spin it enough, or if you spin it in the right way.
Because I think we try too hard a lot of the times, or we like glorify the big idea or chase the big idea, and this can be so intimidating. May not be as big as we're telling ourselves, or as elusive. Obviously, great creative is like hard to come by, but I don't think it's as hard as we make it.
We had as a guest a few weeks ago, Ferris Jakob, who is the co-founder of Genius Steals. And if you go into his website, one of the big bold headlines that flashes across the top of his website is "Originality is a myth." Mm-hmm. And you point that out you say so much in your book. It's like we're not trying to be original. We're trying to take what we know and, like you said, put a spin on it. Mm-hmm. And see the same old in slightly new eyes, and it won't be an original idea, but it'll be an original thought. Mm-hmm. Now I'm being repetitive, but it's not about, don't put that kind of burden on yourself to write something original. Take something that we already know and make it fresh. Maybe that's a way of saying it.
Yeah. I just wanted to add to that, because I think there's a difference between literal stealing, right? Like stealing somebody's idea and consciously doing it, and taking something and it becomes part of you, and then somehow that's incorporated into a new idea. I think really, if you look at any innovation, it's not completely original. It's you take everything that man has learned up until now and recombine it in a new way to come up with something new. So, and I think it's the same with ideas, and since it is a human-led business, right? Despite the ads that I see on Facebook that say, tired of writing copy? Our app will write your blog copy. I'm like, what's the point of having a blog if you're not going to write it? I think that we're all
cheaper
humans,
than a ghostwriter.
Therefore, somehow we're always going to have some unique spin on it. And going back to the stand-up comedy, analogy, you've seen controversies where one comic says, well, you stole material from me. And sometimes you look at the side by sides, you say, well, they're talking about the same premise, but they're really going at it from different angles, or they have a different POV on it. And I wouldn't exactly call that stealing, and they're going to a different place, and it plays a different role in the overall act. Like I think it's easy to say, well, that was stolen, or this, was stolen. I don't want to go too deep down that dead end, but it's just interesting to me because somehow we always make it, unique and personal.
Yeah, but I think it just shows you that there is structure to creativity and patterns, because people do end up in the same places with the same briefs. They're asking the same questions. So, I mean, I think that's why you have to ask different questions. But yeah, comics, if it's observational humor and that's your style, and you have kids, you're going to make observations about being a parent and having kids, and there's going to be a lot of crossover. So it's getting there first.
So Dan, let's do a pivot to the brief. And one of the things that Henry and I have talked about when we speak with freelancers is their unique place in the hierarchy of an ad campaign, whether it's a pitch or a new campaign, whatever it happens to be. Your entree into the brand may be only the brief. So what, in your experience, especially more recently, in the last few years as a seasoned senior creative, what are some of the challenges that you face when you get a brief from a project that you've been hired to do, and how do you deal with those challenges regarding the brief?
I mean, it really depends when you come in on it. If it obviously hasn't been settled yet and there's time to push back, I think earlier in my career I wouldn't have. I would have just complained to nearest art director or whoever. But I think now I will question it. I don't know if it's because I've written a book. I'm an expert in something now. But I really do. I will just point out flaws in it. I think you still see, and it's ridiculous. Like the industry just cannot count to one. There's supposed to be one. It's about one thing. So if anything, I get them to prioritize. I ask them to push back. I challenge them to push back. I feel sometimes I don't know where this is going in my head, but I almost feel trapped, where it's like, there's this exciting opportunity for this brand. This is what it is. We want you to work on it. And then you think it's super clear. You make it mean something, or you're like so optimistic, or this is what I would do with it. And then you get the brief and it's a mess, or they're adding things to it. And there's just multiple things. And unfortunately, sometimes you just have to work with it. But I guess it's a challenge for strategists. That's really where it starts.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting conundrum for a freelancer, because when you work on staff at an agency, if your planning department sucks, your planning department sucks, and you have to work around them. If your planning department is great and you have a good working relationship, that too, and that gives you confidence. So that knowledge, when you're a freelancer, it's like a box of chocolates, right? You never know what you're gonna get, to quote Forrest Gump. And so it could be a great brief, it could be an inspiring brief, or it could be a dud, or it could be a mess, as you've said.
Yeah, bigger brands, bigger agencies, it's more difficult. But when I work direct to brands, I will say no if they ask me to do something, and they don't have a clear tone of voice for their brand or brand personality. And what that's led to, I say no, and here's why. Because you don't have a target, so we won't know if I hit it. And I'm like very risk averse when it comes to my profession and the jobs I take. Because if I do a great job, they'll hire me again. They'll recommend me to the next person. So I'll say no if I think there's too much risk. And so what's happened is then they say, well, can you write a tone of voice or work on higher level brand stuff? And that's actually one, I'd say more profitable, but also I become like, I don't know, the expert in their tone of voice and what their brand should be. So not only do I write it, they then contact me to do all their writing, to review if they're hiring writers, to review their
Become
writing.
Your own strategist.
Yeah, a little bit, yeah. I always loved strategy, and I realized, because it took me a while to get my first job, I just kept working on spec campaigns in my portfolio. I think I got pretty good at figuring out that one thing, and I went through a stretch where I was just kind of tired of working on spec campaigns. I just started going through awards annuals and breaking down campaigns. Be like, what could the one thing have been that would have inspired this work? I probably did it for, I don't know, hundreds of campaigns. But just starting to notice patterns and how simple those insights were.
We talk about that exercise of like, breaking
reverse
down,
engineering.
reverse engineering existing advertising, try to figure out what was the strategy here. And it's fun to do with great advertising, and it's fun to do it with bad advertising too, which makes it, it's like, what the hell were they thinking, or what did they think that they were communicating? Mm-hmm. I one of the things that I lament frequently is that too many people in the agency, regardless of department, the second they leave the agency to go to their personal lives, they interact with advertising the way consumers do, as opposed to as practitioners, always analyzing it. Like, don't skip that ad on YouTube, watch it, and be curious about, like, oh, who's this advertiser? What are they saying? Why are they saying it? We so quickly say, well, that's The Office, and now I'm at home and I don't want to watch advertising, or I'm not thinking about advertising. And I think that a true advertising professional always has that. Like, the analogy I give is, my dad's a cosmetic surgeon. He would never go to the beach and not have a critique of the work that he sees that the women does.
Well, Henry, are you telling me that I should go back and watch Mad Men now? Because I've never watched it. Well, yeah, one of the things that I've heard from creatives, I do training, as you know, Dan. That's my thing, and I almost never get creatives. I usually get a few creatives who are with the marketers, but I rarely get all creatives. But I have from time to time, and one of the things part of the great feedback I get from creatives is, I know a bad brief when I see one, but I don't always have the language to critique it, to push back and say, why is this not X, Y, or Z? And so I wish I had more creatives in my workshops, because that's part of the process of learning how to tear apart a brief, to dissect it, to understand what makes it good, what makes it not so good, and to give you that vocabulary to push back. Now, not everybody hangs out and wants to be a senior creative in their 40s or 50s or beyond. And that's when you really do acquire this deep knowledge and the confidence to push back, much more so. So it really is about vocabulary, getting the vocabulary to say what you need to say.
Yeah. But I remember it was like kind of a resistance in ad school. We all want to be creatives. And strategy class was like, might as well have been accounting for most of the creatives, We're like, weren't that into it, or it was like not my job. But I think it is the most important job, and the best creatives are really good strategists, and the best strategists are really good creatives. And I think as part of building your craft as a creative, you really should develop your strategic thinking and that vocabulary.
A man after my own heart, because I do believe that there's overlap there between when a strategy and creative team are really working well together. They're finishing each other's sentences. They're riffing on each other. And there's respect there. The strategist knows what his role is, but isn't afraid to offer something. And the creatives know what their role is, but they're also not afraid to accept something when they see it as a good piece of advice or a good direction to go in strategically. So the most satisfying work I do with creatives is when they are strategic minded, when they are willing to say, but isn't really the business problem this? And I'm like, oh wow, I hadn't thought of that. Like, when a creative starts thinking on the business side or on the strategy side, then you have something going. Like, that's a person, I go back to Bill Bernbach. Bill Bernbach wasn't just a pure words guy, right? Like, that was a businessman. He knew what the clients wanted to hear and what their business was and how business worked, and only then could he apply his creativity to the problem, was with a deep understanding of what the client's business was.
I found say the amount of help I've got when I felt stuck or inspiration from talking to a strategist versus another creative, it's been like hands down. If you're a creative in listening to this, because I think a lot of times you get briefed and then a lot of agencies, poor ones, separate, and then you're in silos, and you can feel quite alone as a creative and stuck and have no help. And then the strategist is like kind of left out. It's like, here, I've done all this thinking, and here it is in this one page, and you're going to look at this one line. Like, if the brief isn't doing it for you, have conversations. Because I know strategists would love to get involved and should be involved, and the best work does come when we are working together. But in agencies, you can really see it separate. Okay, I've done that. Now we'll go over here quietly and come back to you. Must be quite nerve-wracking as a strategist.
It's extremely gratifying when a creative seeks you out for your advice, and says, hey, I got something I want to run by you, or what do you think about this human truth that was sparked in my mind from what you wrote on the brief, or even this came out of nowhere and not necessarily related to the brief, but what do you think of it? It speaks to the respect that they have for you as a strategist, and that's very gratifying.
I think they should work more as teams, because a lot of time, my first agency was almost frowned upon. It was like if I showed the strategist or the account team before the creative director. But it's like, if you're seen as a team, because you could change the strategic direction or have a thought that's like, what if we did this? Is the client open to doing this? That I think that team should stay more intact. Often, it's easy to say there's like idealistic ways of doing things. Time is not always on our side. Time's not, we can judge a brief, but they don't have endless amount of times to write the perfect brief. Sometimes they got to hammer that out. And so it's even more reason why you should keep working together through the process.
And the irony is that you can save time when you're working together, right? Like it's a lot easier when you're in the same room, riffing off of each other.
Yeah, the challenge that I face, and Henry and I talk about this a lot, is that I work mostly with marketers and clients, sometimes with in-house agencies, and they don't always have, in fact, I could say it's almost rare that they have a strategist on staff. So it's the marketers and the account folks and the creatives who have to put their heads together to sort of play that role. And so that's why I preach collaboration. Now, Henry and I have had our debates about how that works. I think it's an entirely different scenario when it's on the agency side. But when it's on the client side and you don't have a strategist, you really don't have any choice, because sometimes a marketer has 20 minutes to write a brief, and that's disaster. That just guarantees disaster. So the collaborative nature, what you're talking about of working with the strategist, would absolutely benefit the development of a brief when it's the account folks, the brand folks, and maybe a creative huddling together to figure this out, because they don't have any solid training and strategy. That builds a better brief.
Well, yeah. And it's also, when it comes to presenting work, if the people who are helping you, the creatives, sell the work, sell the idea, if they were involved throughout and not just getting it, the day before, 2 days before, and maybe don't even love the idea, it's a tough position to put them in.
So what are some of the responses that you said you got a lot of positive response from your book. What are some of the, are you getting requests to do some things that you hadn't been asked to do before? Are you getting maybe requests to talk to college kids or to other groups? You're doing speaking gigs? What are some of the things that are coming out of the book besides more freelance work? Yeah,
more freelance work, definitely podcasts. Some, I don't know, like big podcasts that I've listened to that I just can't believe they're reaching out to me. I'm starting to believe it now. I think the individual responses where I think it's like, maybe I wrote this thing to help myself, the thing I didn't have, and to hear from young creatives and senior creatives that is having that impact on them. Like that means more than anything. But yeah, I've some agencies, hasn't happened yet, asking me to speak to creatives. I've been talking with a couple. So that there's in the UK, a book club. It's Freelancer magazine, and I'm the first book they're featuring. I know I think I'll be speaking at it, and people have questions. There's almost 100 people, I think, going to be on this thing next month. So yeah, I think things like that are popping up. I'll probably be speaking at agencies and companies, and then podcasts for sure. Yeah, I think it's amazing that how it just seems to elevate myself in the eyes of other people. But definitely, yeah, freelance work as well.
One of the questions we like to ask some of our guests, we haven't asked this consistently, but we do get around to asking it, is from where you sit, Dan, and now as this apparently wildly popular author, are you optimistic or pessimistic about our industry? What are your thoughts about where we're going?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know if I have to choose one. Maybe I'm taking an easy way out here. I think the people who aren't evolving and are staying like stubborn, I think the real advantage is going to be people who start embracing what we've talked about, science and systems, to keep up with the amount of work with all these different platforms, to start producing instead of just putting the same idea on different platforms. I think it's more efficient thinking systems. You see so many industries. I remember I was doing work for, it was the local, I'll say newspapers. They were newspapers at the time, but transitioning into the digital world. And I was like, hey, well, you guys, you got to have your authors on Facebook and Twitter were the big ones then. And they were like unionized, and the authors were like, well, or the journalists were like, well, we're not going to tweet. You're going to have to pay us more. And they didn't know how to monetize the digital side. So they were just selling ads, print ads in the paper. And guarantee you that boardroom I was presenting to 30 people around, it was huge. Like probably 10 of them left, you know. And I think in our industry, I think people like to, I was doing it with a car dealership of last year. And they were like, we're not dead yet. You know, that was their thing. I'm like, okay, so keep going. You're going to die. Like if you don't evolve and start to do things a little differently. So I think it's the same with our industry, and people got to start thinking about thinking and get off the hamster wheel, because the industry is changing. So yeah.
There are people that are offering apps that write copy so that you won't.
Yeah.
So.
Right.
That's how I wrote the book.
Yeah. Well, Dan Nelken, freelance creative, author of the new book, and I shut the book down, so I don't have the title. What's the title again, Dan?
I can't remember. No, it's Self-Help Guide for Copywriters.
Self-Help Guide for Copywriters. Get your copy now on Amazon. Dan, thank you so much for joining Henry and me on the Brief Brothers. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. I could talk to you guys all day. Thanks for this.
Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach, and together we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time, bye-bye.